Day 7 of the Diddy trial kicked off with something no one expected. Diddy smiling, and not just a polite nod or a quiet smirk. He walked into that courtroom like it was a red carpet, flashing grins, exuding confidence, and looking completely unbothered by the storm brewing around him. To anyone watching, it was almost surreal. How could someone facing serious federal charges still show up this cheerful? At one point, he turned to the gallery, the section where the public sits, and made a heart gesture with his hands. He's done it before, it's kind of become his thing lately. But this time, something strange happened. A woman in the crowd sent the gesture right back at him. Same hand heart, same confidence. It wasn't subtle. Now here's where people started whispering, who is this woman? Is she just a fan, a supporter, a family member? Maybe one of Diddy's former partners? No one seemed to know, and courtroom officials didn't clarify. What was clear though was that the moment added a strange emotional layer to the day's events. It was a courtroom, not a concert, and yet for a second it felt like the two worlds blurred. It left people wondering, was Diddy trying to project strength, send a message, show loyalty to someone in the room? Or was it just his way of controlling the energy in the space, reminding everyone he's still Diddy, still charismatic, still in command? Whatever the case, it set the tone for the rest of the day. Unexpected, tense, and full of contradictions. David James walked into that courtroom as a former assistant, but by the time he left the witness stand, he had become a key figure. Not just a supporting voice, but someone who had lived inside the Diddy empire day and night for years. And what he described wasn't a glamorous life behind the scenes of hip-hop royalty. It was something far more intense, controlled, isolated, cult-like. According to James, working for Diddy meant surrendering your personal life completely. Sleep schedules didn't exist. Work days regularly started early in the morning and rolled into the next, 20-hour shifts, 7 days a week, with no clear end in sight. Vacations, time off, boundaries, they weren't part of the conversation. If Diddy wanted you present, you were there. And if you weren't, well, you didn't last long. But it wasn't just the schedule. It was the atmosphere. James painted a picture of an environment built entirely on fear and silence. No one questioned Diddy. No one challenged him. Whether you were a driver, a creative, a personal assistant, or a performer, your role was to serve and to keep quiet. The line between personal and professional didn't just blur. It disappeared completely. He spoke about how people around Diddy treated him like some kind of untouchable force. If he made a demand, it wasn't a request. It was a command. If he was displeased, everyone felt the shift in the air. Even casual encounters were drenched in anxiety. Employees would whisper among themselves, careful not to say too much. Everyone was aware that at any moment things could turn, and yet people stayed. Not because they loved it, but because leaving felt even more dangerous. James described how the inner circle functioned like a system. Not just a group of employees, but a carefully maintained operation where everyone played a part and no one dared step out of line. There were perks, of course. Access to fame, luxury, and proximity. To power. But those came at a price. Complete obedience. What made his testimony hit even harder was how calm and deliberate he was. He wasn't ranting. He wasn't crying. He was just stating facts. Day after day, year after year, this is what life looked like behind Diddy's public image. And what stuck with people most wasn't just the lifestyle. It was the structure, the organization, the sense that this wasn't chaos. It was a system that had been built and protected for a very long time. One of the more surreal revelations from David James wasn't about what Diddy did, but about what he expected from others. Specifically, how far he would go to prove a point or to protect his image. At one point in his employment, James was accused of stealing. Not once, but twice. The first incident involved a missing love bracelet that belonged to Cassie. The second, a luxury watch that Diddy couldn't find. Now, in most workplaces, these situations might result in a tense conversation, maybe a suspension. But in Diddy's world, they meant a lie detector test. James testified that he was forced to take not one, but 2 polygraph exams. The kind you usually associate with federal investigations, not music industry assistance. Both tests were arranged quickly, and both came with an unspoken message: prove your loyalty or else. He passed both tests, at least in terms of the specific items in question. But during the second session, something unexpected happened. Something that would later say more about the work environment than the missing objects ever could. James admitted to the examiner that yes, he had once taken something, not Cassie's. A bracelet, not the watch, but a pair of Sean John jeans, Diddy's clothing brand, and a small bottle of Ciroc. That was it. A pair of pants and a mini bottle of liquor. Not exactly grand larceny. But in that environment, even a small act of taking something without permission felt like a potential career-ending offense. The fact that James felt compelled to confess that during a polygraph test speaks volumes. Not just about his own conscience, but about the psychological pressure he, and likely others, were constantly under. The surveillance, the suspicion, the assumption that if something was missing, it had to be someone from the inside. That's what made this detail stick. Because it wasn't really about jeans or bracelets or alcohol, it was about control. About Diddy cultivating an atmosphere where everyone was watched, second-guessed, and kept on edge. Who makes their assistant take a lie detector test over a misplaced item? And what kind of workplace accepts that as normal? More than anything, it raised questions that go beyond Diddy himself, about the nature of power, about how loyalty can be weaponized, and about the things people are willing to endure when they think there's no other way out. What David James described next didn't just shock the courtroom, it reframed everything we thought we knew about the dynamic between Diddy and the people who worked for him. It started with a New Year's Eve party. James admitted he had taken ecstasy that night, and not just any ecstasy. He took it from Diddy's personal stash, a designer medical bag packed with pills and other substances. But the real moment came the next morning. Diddy called him over. No anger, no yelling, just quiet calculation. He showed James video footage from the night before. Footage of James, clearly high, partying, vibing, Diddy bopping, as they called it. That was the term. A strange nickname for the high, spaced-out euphoria that came with drug use inside Diddy's inner circle. Then Diddy looked at him and said something that chilled the room. I'm going to keep this in case I need it. Yeah. Didn't need to say the word blackmail. He didn't have to. The message was clear. James was on tape, under the influence, using drugs taken from Diddy's own supply. That video wasn't just a souvenir from a wild night. It was leverage. Quiet, subtle leverage. What James described wasn't just an offhand comment. It fit a pattern, each one that other witnesses had alluded to. A pattern of surveillance, manipulation, and long-term psychological control. It was never about one party or one decision. It was about slowly building an archive of moments that could be used later. Not necessarily to harm, but to silence. And that's where the weight of this moment really hit. Because if this happened with James, an assistant, who worked closely with Diddy? How many others had similar experiences? How many had their mistakes recorded, their private moments documented, their loyalty tested and filed away? It painted a picture of someone who wasn't just obsessed with control in the moment, but with keeping that control long after the music stopped, long after the party ended. And James didn't even suggest Diddy threatened him directly. He just remembered the tone, the timing, the subtle message behind those 6 words, in case I need it. Not many people in the courtroom spoke after that. They didn't need to. The silence said enough. By now, the courtroom had heard enough to understand that drugs weren't just part of the party, they were part of the job. But James went further. He explained exactly where the drugs came from, who controlled them, and how they were stored. It wasn't random, it wasn't reckless. It was organized. Diddy, according to James, carried a Louis Vuitton medical bag everywhere. Not a first aid kit, a luxury branded pharmacy. Inside, there were pills for just about everything. Viagra, opioids, birth control, Plan B, and even abortion pills. And James was clear, many of these drugs weren't in Diddy's name. Some were prescribed under aliases, others were linked to employees. One name came up more than once, Frank Black. The pseudonym Diddy allegedly used when checking into hotels or obtaining medications he didn't want traced back to him. Then came the ecstasy. James admitted he once took a dose from that bag during a New Year's Eve celebration, the same night that later got him recorded on video. But what stood out wasn't just the act itself, it was the culture around it. Because in Diddy's circle, using these substances wasn't taboo. It was expected, it was social. And there was even a nickname for it, Diddy bopping. To outsiders, the term might sound playful, maybe even harmless, but to those inside the circle, it meant something else entirely. It meant you were vibing, you were Hi, you were on something, and that was normal. In fact, it was part of the identity of the group. If you were around Diddy long enough, you probably heard it, you probably said it, you probably lived it. And this is where the prosecution's case began to crystallize. Because James wasn't just a friend or a party guest. He was on Diddy's payroll. That distinction mattered. If you're running a business, a real legal business, you can't have your employees taking illegal drugs, especially from your personal stash. You can't normalize it, you can't joke about it, and you definitely can't record it. James's testimony didn't just make Diddy look irresponsible, it made him look deliberate, calculated, like the drugs were part of a larger system, one that blurred every line between personal and professional, legal and illegal. And that culture, according to James, came from the top. No one brought drugs around Diddy. Diddy had them. Diddy controlled them. Diddy set the tone. And for those who worked for him, the only options were go along or get left behind. Of all the disturbing details in David James's testimony, one moment stood out for how intimate, unsettling, and telling it was. It didn't happen on stage. It didn't happen in a boardroom. It happened in a hotel room. James recalled an evening where he had been instructed to help set up for what insiders called a freak-off. One of Diddy's private encounters, often involving multiple people, adult entertainers, or escorts. It was part of the assistant job, according to James. He'd be given a location, sometimes a list of items to bring, and he'd make sure the room was ready. Candles, music, protection, drugs. That was the routine. But on this particular night, things didn't go according to plan. James showed up at the hotel and knocked on the door. No response. He knocked again. Still nothing. Eventually, using the master key card he had been given, something common for these situations, he opened the door and stepped inside. What he saw stopped him cold. Cassie was lying on the bed, completely unconscious, not just sleeping, out cold, flat on her back, arms still at her sides, motionless. He made a point to note this because according to him, Cassie usually slept on her side. Something about this felt different, off, wrong. And she wasn't alone. Standing nearby was a man James didn't recognize. Roughly 5'8", long hair, and as James bluntly put it, a huge package. That was the language he used, and it clearly made a lasting impression on him. Because even years later, he remembered that physical detail with eerie clarity. It was burned into his memory. When the man saw James enter, he immediately ran into the bathroom, trying to disappear. Diddy, meanwhile, was already inside, in the shower. James stood there, frozen. The scene spoke for itself. Cassie unconscious on the bed, an unknown man hiding, Diddy nearby, casually bathing, and James in the middle of it, just trying to outdo his job. There was no screaming, no confrontation, but the silence of that moment and the awkwardness, the confusion, the danger said everything. It raised questions that didn't have easy answers. What had just happened? What was going to happen? Why was Cassie in that state? Who was that man? James didn't speculate. He didn't guess. He just described what he saw. And that's what made it land with so much force, because it wasn't exaggerated. It wasn't dramatized. It was just real. That brief window into the private world behind Diddy's closed doors made something crystal clear. This wasn't just about parties. It wasn't just about drugs or ego or control. There were people in that world, especially women, who may not have had the power to say no or the ability to walk away. And the people who witnessed it, they didn't always know what to do either. Sometimes it's not what's said in court, it's what connects the dots. And one of those dots came from a tense and unexpected memory involving Suge Knight, late night burgers, and a moment that could have gone very, very wrong. David James testified about a seemingly routine errand. He and Diddy's bodyguard, a man known as D-Rock, had been sent to Mel's Diner, a famous LA staple, to pick up cheeseburgers. Nothing unusual. But as they waited in the parking lot, things took a sudden turn. James spotted a familiar eye-face, Suge Knight, seated in a nearby vehicle. Anyone who knows hip-hop history knows the name. Suge was the face of Death Row Records, and for years one of Diddy's most powerful rivals. Their beef goes back decades. And even in 2024, seeing Suge unexpectedly meant tension. Always. James and D-Rock didn't panic. In fact, Suge walked up to their car window and dapped them up. a friendly gesture, at least on the surface. But almost immediately after that brief interaction, James noticed something strange. SUVs, 4 of them, pulling in from different sides of the lot surrounding the area. It wasn't subtle. It felt tactical, like exits were being watched, options were being limited. James didn't know what was coming, but every instinct told him, get out. Fast they bailed, left the food behind, left the scene altogether, just drove off. But that wasn't the end of it. Later that night, James was tasked with driving Diddy, and when Diddy got into the car, he wasn't empty-handed. On his lap were 3 handguns. They headed straight back toward Mel's diner. By the time they arrived, Suga was gone. The SUVs had vanished. Nothing happened, but the implication was clear. Diddy wasn't planning to talk it out. He was prepared for something else entirely. What made this moment so significant wasn't just attention, it was how it lined up with other testimony. Earlier in the trial, Cassie had recounted a moment when Diddy panicked after hearing that. Suge Knight had been spotted nearby. She remembered him grabbing a gun, rushing out, leaving her in tears. At the time, people questioned the timeline, the details. Was she remembering it right? But now, with James's testimony completely separate, yet eerily aligned, that story gained new weight. 2 witnesses, 2 angles, 1 night, and the pieces suddenly matched. For James, it was a breaking point. He wasn't from that world. He didn't grow up around guns, gang tension, or street codes. He had been a salesman before working in entertainment, an assistant, a guy just trying to build a career. But this night made it clear, whatever he thought he was signing up for, this wasn't it. And soon after, he quit. By now, the courtroom had heard the name Louis Vuitton more than a few times. And not because of fashion. In Diddy's world, one particular Louis Vuitton bag became something far more significant than a luxury accessory. It was, according to David James, a mobile pharmacy, a traveling vault of secrets, and potentially evidence of something much deeper. James testified in detail about this bag. It wasn't casually packed, it was curated. Inside were items that painted a very specific picture of Diddy's lifestyle. Not just personal habits, but the culture he allegedly maintained around him. The bag contained Viagra, birth control pills, Plan B, abortion pills, painkillers like Percocet, and ecstasy. Not just loose pills, but ecstasy tablets molded in the shape of Barack Obama. Yes, Barack Obama. When James said it in court, people didn't know whether to laugh, gasp, or just try to process it. Who even makes something like that? Were they custom? Was it some kind of dark joke? Street drug culture does sometimes stamp pills with famous faces, but the image of a former US president pressed into a party drug and kept in Diddy's personal stash was hard to shake. But what mattered more than the strangeness was the structure. James said that the bag wasn't in Diddy's name. In fact, many of the drugs weren't. Prescriptions were sometimes filled under aliases, sometimes under the names of employees. The name Frank Black came up again. An identity Diddy allegedly used when checking into hotels and filling prescriptions he didn't want tied to him. It wasn't just about possession. It was about concealment, about building walls between what was real and what could be proven. The bag followed Diddy everywhere. Hotels, parties, business trips. It wasn't hidden in a closet or locked in a safe. It was with him, always. James described having to carry it at times, knowing full well what was inside. And if anyone asked, you didn't answer. In many ways, the bag became a symbol of everything the prosecution is trying to argue. That this wasn't a man who occasionally partied too hard or made reckless choices. It was someone who allegedly created a system, one that blurred every line between business and pleasure, privacy and manipulation, legality and danger, and that system, according to James, was as mobile and constant as the man himself. You didn't need to raid Diddy's house to find the drugs. They were on him, in the room, in the car, in the bag, all the time. It was one of those details that almost slipped by until you realize what it really meant. David James testified that during his time working for Diddy, one of his regular responsibilities was shopping for certain items. Not groceries, not office supplies, but baby oil, Astroglide, and condoms, over and over again. At first glance, it might sound like a harmless, even awkward part of being a personal assistant. Celebrities are eccentric, right? But James made something very clear. This wasn't just part of the personal side of Diddy's life. It was a task that came with secrecy, intention, and a complete erasure of professional boundaries. Every time James made these purchases, he was told not to include them in any formal expense report. That meant no receipts submitted to the company, no invoices logged, no digital paper trail. Instead, he was reimbursed in cash, usually through security staff, and the transaction disappeared. It might seem like a small thing, but in the world of federal investigations, it's exactly the kind of detail that matters, because it's not just what you buy, it's how you try to hide it. Why would an international music mogul go out of his way to conceal the purchase of lubricants and condoms? Because, according to prosecutors, it wasn't just about sex. It was about control, about maintaining plausible deniability, about shielding a pattern of behavior that was starting to emerge in testimony after testimony. James wasn't buying these items for Diddy's personal stash. He was buying them in preparation for events, for encounters, for nights where, as multiple witnesses have described, Diddy allegedly brought in escorts, manipulated guests, and blurred the line between intimacy and coercion. And remember, James wasn't a friend doing a favor. He was on payroll, which means the people buying these products weren't doing so voluntarily or for their own use. They were following orders in a professional context. For a man who ran an entertainment company, what makes this even more relevant is how it ties into the larger RICO case. Prosecutors are arguing that these purchases and how they were handled support a larger allegation that sex work and possibly trafficking were not random or isolated in Diddy's orbit. They were part of a routine, a system, a business model concealed behind fame and luxury. James never said that outright. He didn't need to. All he had to do was describe the pattern, buy the products. Don't ask questions. Don't leave a record. Get paid in cash. Move on. But when that pattern is repeated enough times and supported by enough witnesses, it starts to look less like a coincidence and more like a system that was never meant to be seen. You don't expect to hear a former US president's name in a celebrity trial, let alone twice. And yet, during his testimony, David James casually dropped one of the most unexpected bombshells of the week: Barack Obama. The first mention was bizarre enough. James revealed that among the contents of Diddy's Louis Vuitton drug bag were ecstasy pills shaped like Obama's face, molded, stamped, unmistakable. And he wasn't speculating, he saw them himself. The courtroom didn't quite know how to react. Some jurors looked stunned, others confused. Was it real? Were these some kind of novelty pills? Was it common in drug culture? Even seasoned legal observers whispered, did he just say Obama? But James didn't elaborate. He wasn't joking. He said it with the same flat tone he used to describe condoms, Plan B, or Frank Black. Why Obama? Was it a coincidence? A political statement? A power flex? It didn't make sense at first, until James brought his name up again. This time, in a very different context. When prosecutors asked about the types of people Diddy met with, the circles he kept, James didn't hesitate. He mentioned celebrities, of course, artists, executives. But then, without drama, he said former presidents. And when they asked which one specifically, he repeated it: Barack Obama. That name, again. But now, not as a caricature stamped into a drug, but as someone Diddy had reportedly met with in real life. The connection wasn't explained in detail. There were no dates, no photos, no follow-ups. But the implication hung in the air. This wasn't just a music mogul who partied hard. This was someone who, at least according to a former insider, had walked in rooms with world leaders. For the prosecution, it raised a chilling contrast. A man who allegedly kept a pharmacy in his bag, who filmed people without their knowledge, who used surveillance and silence to maintain control. And yet this same man could apparently sit at the table with the most powerful people in the world. It blurred the lines even more. How does someone accused of this level of misconduct get close to a former president? Was it influence? Was it image? Or was it the power of celebrity, the way fame itself can open doors that would otherwise stay locked? Whatever the reason, one thing was clear: the presence of Obama's name in this trial wasn't just shocking. It reminded everyone that Diddy's reach wasn't just wide, it was global. And the consequences of that reach, depending on what the court decides, may stretch far beyond Hollywood and hip-hop. As David James continued laying out the inner workings of Diddy's empire, the defense finally saw an opening, a way to challenge his credibility, to raise doubts without needing to deny the details. It came down to one word: proffer. During cross-examination, Diddy's lead attorney, Mark Agnifilo, zeroed in on a crucial point. Why? He asked. Would James testify so openly about behavior that could implicate him too? About drug use? Transporting narcotics? Buying items for freak-offs? Things that weren't just morally questionable, but potentially illegal. James didn't hesitate. Calmly, he said what everyone in the courtroom had started to suspect. He has a proffer agreement with the government. That one sentence changed everything. A proffer agreement is a legal mechanism, often called a queen, for a day deal that allows a witness to speak openly to prosecutors without fear of immediate prosecution, as long as they tell the truth. It's not immunity exactly, but it's a form of protection, a sign that the government sees you as useful, as a tool, as someone who's better on their side than on the defense's. And that made James more than just a witness. It made him a cooperator. For the defense, this was a lifeline. Agnifilo leaned hard into the idea that James might be shading the truth or embellishing details to save himself. That he might be saying what the government wanted to hear in exchange for protection. After all, if his own role in illegal activities could be exposed, wouldn't he do anything to avoid a charge? It was a classic strategy. Shift the focus from what was said to why it was being said. But the problem? James didn't look nervous. He didn't stutter. He didn't contradict himself. He answered each question like a man who had already made peace with whatever fallout might come. And more importantly, his account wasn't standing alone. By this point in the trial, multiple witnesses had backed up elements of his story. From the polygraphs to the freak-offs, from the drug culture to the surveillance, nothing James described sounded like a solo invention. In fact, most of it echoed earlier testimony, which made he's only saying this to protect himself. Argument feel weak. Still, the defense pressed on. Agnifilo tried to soften James's portrayal of Diddy, asking whether he respected him as a businessman. James said yes, he admitted Diddy was brilliant in business. That bad boy entertainment often felt like a family, that he formed genuine friendships with people there. He even described a close relationship with Diddy's mother, a detail that at first sounded like a moment of warmth, but it didn't last, because the longer James spoke, the clearer it became. Even in that family, fear was the unspoken rule. Love was conditional, and loyalty, at least as Diddy defined it, meant silence. So yes, he had a proffer agreement. Yes, he was protecting himself. But what he described wasn't just self-defense. It was a pattern, a system. And the government clearly believed it was real enough to put on the record. At some point in his testimony, David James used a word that seemed almost out of place: family. He wasn't talking about his own. He was talking about Bad Boy Entertainment, the music label, the business, the machine, and how in Diddy's world, it was sold to everyone inside as something deeper than a job. According to James, being part of Diddy's team didn't just mean working hard, it meant belonging, or at least that's how it was pitched. From the outside, it looked like success. Music videos, award shows, celebrity parties. But on the inside, it felt like a tightly managed emotional web. One where the lines between boss and brother, between employee and family, were intentionally blurred. He spoke about how employees were encouraged to see each other not as co-workers, but as a tribe. There were birthday celebrations, inside jokes, and moments of closeness. He even described a kind of rapport with Diddy's mother, a powerful, maternal presence in the inner circle. She'd show up often, check in with the staff, and sometimes even defend Diddy's actions when things got tense. It was a culture that wrapped itself in loyalty, and at first it felt like safety. But over time, James realized that this idea of family came with strings attached. Loyalty wasn't just appreciated, it was expected. Dissent, even subtle, wasn't welcome. Questioning orders, even unethical ones, meant you were disloyal. And if you wanted to stay, you had to play along. That's when the image started to shift. Because in many families, there's space for disagreement, for speaking up, for being human. But in Diddy's version, according to James, family was used as a shield, a defense mechanism. a reason not to report, not to push back, not to leave, even when things got dark. And it wasn't just emotional manipulation. There were rumors, James mentioned them carefully, about darker moments. Incidents involving Diddy and his mother that no one dared talk about out loud. Whispers of violence, of control, of a dynamic that didn't match the image projected on red carpets and magazine covers. James didn't accuse. He didn't speculate, but he left enough unsaid to make people in the room sit up straight. He also mentioned something subtle but telling. Diddy's last name changes. Over the years, he'd cycled through Puff Daddy, Puffy, Diddy, Brother Love, and finally just Love, a name that to the outside world might have seemed like a rebrand. But to James, it felt like something else, a tactic. Because when you call yourself Love, when you tell your team you're all one big family, you create a culture where betrayal becomes unthinkable and where silence, even in the face of pain, becomes a kind of proof of loyalty. For James, looking back, the family wasn't a lie, but it wasn't unconditional either. It was just another part of the system. In the middle of a trial filled with surveillance footage, drug testimonies, and allegations of blackmail, one moment offered something entirely unexpected. A brief burst of laughter, not from the media, not from the public, but from inside the courtroom itself. It came during David James's testimony when he described an encounter that was awkward, embarrassing, and oddly telling. James recalled being set up with a woman, not by a friend, but by Roger Bond, another figure in Diddy's inner circle. At the time, he assumed it was just a casual introduction. Nothing formal, no red flags, just two adults meeting up. They hooked up. And afterward, as James was getting dressed, the woman casually asked him for $200. James was confused, not angry, just confused. I thought it was just normal, he told the court. He went to Bond afterward and asked, "She's asking for money?" And Bond replied without missing a beat, "Yeah, she's a worker." That's when it clicked. The woman wasn't just a friend of a friend, she was a sex worker. And James hadn't known until after the fact. He paid her, reluctantly. But the part that truly caught the courtroom off guard was what happened next. After their encounter, the woman asked to use the shower. James, still stunned by everything, joked to the court, "I wanted my money back." It was a rare break in the tension. Jurors chuckled, even some attorneys smiled. But it didn't change what the moment represented, because underneath the humor was a pattern, one that had come up again and again in the trial. Escorts weren't just part of Diddy's nightlife. They were allegedly part of his inner circle, hired, scheduled, brought into the fold by his staff, sometimes with consent, sometimes without full clarity, sometimes with expectations left deliberately vague. James' story was small, yes, but it echoed something larger, a culture where sex, power, and business were constantly intertwined, and where even someone on the inside could find themselves caught off guard, confused, or manipulated. The defense may have hoped to use this story to discredit James, to show him as naive or reckless. But if anything, it made him more relatable, because in that moment, he wasn't a power player. He was just a guy who thought he was meeting someone, and ended up realizing it was part of something much more complicated. And while the jury laughed for a moment, they also took note. When Regina Ventura, Cassie's mother, took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. She didn't testify for long. There were no theatrics, no cross-examination, just a short, clear, devastating account. And then she stepped down. But in that brief time, she left a deep mark. She confirmed what many had heard through Cassie's earlier testimony, but hearing it from a mother made it harder to ignore. She spoke about an email Cassie had sent her. A chilling message warning that Diddy had threatened to release sex tapes, recordings from the so-called freak-offs, unless Cassie and her family paid him $20,000. And this wasn't some vague threat whispered in anger. It was written, direct. And it came with a deadline. Cassie's parents didn't have that kind of money. They weren't industry people. They weren't wealthy. They were just parents, scared, out of options. So they did what terrified, desperate parents sometimes do. They mortgaged their home. They borrowed against the roof over their heads to protect their daughter from public humiliation, and possibly worse. No one interrupted Regina as she described this. No one challenged her. The defense didn't cross-examine her, didn't ask for clarification, didn't push back. That silence in a trial this contentious spoke louder than any objection could. It told the jury something crucial. This happened, and for many watching, it revealed the kind of pressure Cassie may have been under for years. not just from Diddy, but from the fear of what he might do, and how her actions could impact her family, a fear that reached all the way to her mother's front door. But Regina wasn't done. She went on to describe a separate incident that added even more weight to her daughter's testimony. A moment in Los Angeles when Diddy and Cassie had gotten into a heated argument. Cassie had called her mother for support, worried, maybe scared. But before she could speak freely, Diddy told her, "Tell your mother you're fine." Then he grabbed Cassie's phone and jumped out of the car, running down Wilshire Boulevard with it in hand, leaving her stranded without communication for hours. Regina was panicked. She hadn't heard back from her daughter. She knew something was off. So she did what any parent would do. She called the police. This wasn't secondhand gossip. It wasn't speculative. It was confirmation, straight from a mother's mouth, that her daughter was being isolated, intimidated, and monitored. And once again, the courtroom didn't move. No rebuttals, no skepticism, just quiet. Because there's something about a mother's voice, calm, steady, and sincere. That's hard to discredit. And in this case, it didn't need to be loud to be devastating. It sounded like something from a bad movie. Dramatic, childish, even absurd. But in the courtroom, it landed with gravity. Because this wasn't a rumor. This wasn't hearsay. It was real, and it was confirmed by both Cassie and her mother. The story goes back to a car ride in Los Angeles. Cassie and Diddy were in the middle of yet another argument. Tension was high, emotions boiling over, and Cassie, feeling overwhelmed, reached out to the one person she trusted most, her mother. She picked up her phone, maybe to call or text, just to let her know things weren't okay. That's when Diddy stopped her. According to testimony, he looked at her and said, "Tell your mother you're fine." Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "Let's calm down." Just a command, a script, control. And then without warning, he grabbed the phone from her hands, jumped out of the car, and took off running down Wilshire Boulevard in broad daylight with Cassie's phone in his hand. She was left alone. No phone, no way to contact anyone, no way to call for help. For hours, Cassie's mother heard nothing. She waited, she worried. Until finally, realizing that something was very wrong, she called the police. Diddy eventually returned the phone, but by then the damage was done. Not just emotionally, but legally. Because what seemed like a petty, impulsive move actually fit a pattern prosecutors had been laying out since day one. Isolation, domination, and surveillance. Think about it. If you control someone's communication, you control the narrative. You control who they reach, what they say, and when they can speak. Taking Cassie's phone wasn't just about winning an argument. It was about cutting off her lifeline. And according to the broader testimony, it wasn't an isolated event. It was part of a long history of interference and emotional manipulation. What makes this moment even more significant is that it wasn't denied by the defense. They didn't challenge Cassie's memory of it. They didn't question Regina Ventura's account. In fact, they stayed quiet. And that silence, again, was louder than any argument because this wasn't a scandal. It was a symptom. One more incident in a string of behaviors that painted a picture, not just of a powerful man, but of someone who allegedly used that power to keep the people around him close and quiet. The phone snatch wasn't about the phone. It was about control. Name alone was enough to make people in the courtroom shift in their seats. The Punisher. That's how he was known. Not legally, but among the people who attended Diddy's private parties. Among those who participated in the now infamous freak-offs. He had been referenced before. During Cassie's earlier testimony, prosecutors showed her a booklet of photos, men she had encountered in Diddy's orbit. When she got to his picture, she didn't know his name, but she recognized the face, and she remembered the nickname. "That's the Punisher," she said. Now, weeks later, that same man stood in court. His real name wasn't used much. In this world, identities were often blurred on purpose. But what he described was clear and deeply familiar to anyone following the case. He was a male escort, brought into Diddy's world through intermediaries, scheduled for parties, paid for services, and expected to show up. Not just physically, but fully compliant. He described the way things were arranged, what time to arrive, what to bring, how to behave. Sometimes he was told in advance who else would be there, sometimes not, and once again the same pattern emerged. Baby oil, Astroglide, condoms, cameras, pills, cash, rules without explanations. His testimony mirrored what another escort, Daniel Phillips, had said earlier in the trial. That these weren't wild nights of consensual chaos. They were events, orchestrated, rehearsed, managed, and the people involved, they weren't always on equal footing. Power, real unspoken power, always tilted toward Diddy. The Punisher didn't seem nervous on the stand. He wasn't defensive, he didn't cry or hesitate, he just told his story. And while he didn't frame himself as a victim, what he described raised serious legal and moral questions. There were questions of consent, of payment, of documentation. Was this sex work? Was it trafficking? Was it part of a larger business? Model, that's exactly what prosecutors want the jury to consider, because what's emerging from these testimonies is not a string of wild parties or isolated incidents. It's the outline of an alleged system where sex, money, image, and control were tangled together, often at the expense of the people involved. And what makes the Punisher's testimony especially powerful is what it doesn't include. No deal with prosecutors, no apparent motive to lie. He wasn't trying to save himself. He was simply confirming what others had already said, in his own words, from his own view. By the time he stepped down, the courtroom wasn't laughing. They weren't even whispering, because it no longer felt like a case about rumors. It felt like a system finally unraveling, one witness at a time. By the end of day 7, one thing was clear. The prosecution wasn't rushing. They were building. Brick by brick, testimony by testimony, they were constructing something deliberate and increasingly difficult to ignore. David James had dominated most of the day, delivering a multi-layered account of life inside the bad boy empire. From polygraphs and drug bags to freak-offs and surveillance, his testimony added structure to what had previously felt like scattered allegations. He wasn't just confirming rumors, he was connecting dots, backing up timelines, naming names. Then came Cassie's mother, Regina Ventura, quiet, calm, and unshakable. Her story didn't need embellishment. It spoke for itself. A family pushed to the edge, forced to mortgage their home just to protect their daughter from public shame and potential harm. And not a single question from the defense. That silence was strategic. It told the jury, we can't challenge this without making things worse. And then, as the day wound down, came the Punisher, a man without a deal, without a script, just his version of the same story others had told, one of structure, not spontaneity, of consent blurred by cash, of control disguised as glamour. Throughout the day, the defense did what it could. They probed James about his proffer agreement, suggesting that his story might be shaped by self-preservation. They tried to highlight moments of contradiction. They even managed to squeeze in a few light moments, like James' confusion over paying a prostitute, hoping to humanize him or inject doubt. But here's the problem with relying on cross-examination. It only works if the foundation is weak, and by the end of day 7, the foundation looks stronger than ever. What's becoming increasingly clear is that this trial isn't just about isolated actions. It's about a culture, a system, a world that operated behind closed doors for years, protected by money, fame, and fear, and is now being peeled back, witness by witness. The prosecution knows the clock is ticking. This trial is expected to last 8 to 10 weeks, and they are not trying to deliver shock value all at once. They're letting it build, letting the jury sit with it, letting the weight of each story accumulate until it becomes undeniable. Whether they'll prove Rico beyond a reasonable doubt, that remains to be seen. But if day 7 was any indication, they're not missing their targets. Not yet.